Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. The purpose of our lecture today is to review an introduction, a summary, a survey of the evidence to support the thesis that a master conspiracy has been working to impose domination over the entire world during the past 2 centuries. This historical thesis of a master conspiracy is best associated with the work of the British 20th century historian Nesta Webster, and also with the work of the late Robert Welch, the founder of the John Birch Society. I should perhaps digress for a moment and explain why I came to collect this evidence during the past 2 decades. It was the result of my first meeting with Mr. Welch in 1967. I was then in high school in Virginia, and after he gave a speech in my area, I had a chance to question him for a moment. I asked him when some evidence about World War II and conspiratorial planning behind it would be available. And he turned to me rather abruptly and said, "Well, why don't you research it and write it?" Needless to say, with the tremendous respect I felt for him then and always, I was rather overwhelmed by that suggestion. But I began to collect the evidence, and I found that in reading and researching it with the help of a good deal of very well-read, knowledgeable, and scholarly friends and associates to guide me, I found that it's a bottomless pit of study. One set of references, one set of information leads you inevitably to more links, more connections, more references, and more sources. So the last 20 years have been devoted to digging further into that study, and today we're going to review a sampling, just a little bit, a small portion of the mountain of evidence that exists to substantiate the thesis. But I think it's very important when we begin to discuss the subject, as emotionally charged, as complex a concept as conspiracy, to define very carefully in the beginning what we mean when we use that word. Certainly it helps to communicate this idea better, to understand it more precisely, and to avoid confusions and misunderstandings. When we talk about the concept of conspiracy in history, any example of it, we're first of all talking about a uniquely human activity. We don't read about lower animals conspiring. It's a human activity, and it always has several essential characteristics. It's an activity involving more than one person, in which the parties to the activity are advancing basically the same or common objectives. Third and finally, they are advancing objectives which most of us would agree by reasonable standards are personally harmful, evil, or destructive. And they're doing all of this, finally, without either advertising this fully in advance to their intended victims, or often we say they're working in secret. Now that's all that is, strictly speaking, essential to the concept. Please notice what it does not assume. Please notice what is not contained in that definition. First of all, it does not say that all of these people are doing these similar things, working toward these similar goals for common reasons or motivations, or for the same reason or motivation. Individuals can conspire toward destructive and evil ends for a variety of different reasons, for whatever goal or value that it is satisfying for them. Also, please notice that it does not say that the conspirators must use any formal organizational structure, issue membership cards, have badges, identification, or wear uniforms. All of those things are optional means and mechanics that are not essential to the definition, but which are optional in each case. And notice that we're focusing strictly upon the actions of the individuals who choose to conspire when we recognize this concept as a reality in history. And we should avoid 2 common misunderstandings. First of all, we should not equate these actions which constitute conspiracy with necessarily the organizations to which the conspirators belong or in which they meet and discuss and make their plans. Those meeting places are not the conspiracy itself, but places in which some conspiring may occur. Also, conspiracy cannot be identified on the basis of any non-essential human characteristics over which individuals have no control, such as racial, religious, or ethnic background. So if we understand that we're talking about something very much rooted in human assumptions of free will and morality, I think we can understand that this is a very reasonable concept and one that we can identify through historical research. Now, to move into the thesis, as background, we must realize that down through the ages there have been a number of secret societies, many conspiratorial movements that had as their goals absolute rule of the world and the final destruction of all existing governments and religions. It's possible, with a great deal of study, to trace the origins and developments of many of these movements and their beliefs all the way back to the early anti-Christian mysticism of the Gnostics. A conspiracy against Orthodox Islam and for world power was founded by a man named Hassan Sabah in 1090 A.D. as the Order of the Assassins. The Catholic Order of Knights Templar had heretical leaders who adopted the assassin system for the destruction of Christianity and brought that conspiracy, along with devil worship, back to Western Europe after their contact with the assassins during the Crusades. The rival Knights of the Teutonic Order under Frederick Barbarossa and Frederick II conducted a campaign against the papacy in Italy. In France, about 1185, the Congregation of Peace, or that's what they called themselves, promoted ownership of all land by the people and, acting as good pacifists, of course, burned castles, monasteries, and churches. During the 13th through the 17th centuries, there were many groups like the Luciferians, the Rosicrucians, the Levelers, and others who continued this consistent undermining and war against Christianity that the Templars had begun in Europe. And it's possible to establish that these latter groups through the centuries were not merely imitating each other or some older system of belief. There are some organizational links that can be found in similarities between the Templars and the Rosicrucians and other groups. But of course, the problem is that dealing with very fragmentary evidence in admittedly shadowy caves of history, it is impossible to establish that there is any unbroken organizational continuity up through these centuries until we come to the really beginning point of our thesis today. Inspired by a number of the radical philosophers of the French Academy during the latter decades of the 18th century, and instructed by a mysterious occultist from Denmark about whom we know very little, it was a professor of canon law at the University of Ingolstadt who established a continuing organizational structure to direct the worldwide attack on religion and monarchy, which organizational structure was intended to rule the world. His name was Adam Weishaupt, and the organization he founded on May 1st, 1776, was called the Order of the Illuminati. Weishaupt planned for the order to maintain publicly the image of a charitable and philanthropic organization. It was this image which attracted so many educators and Protestant clergymen in Germany. When they joined, they were convinced that the goal of the order was the purest form of Christianity, to make of all mankind one happy and prosperous family. However, as these people were examined and tested, the real motivations came to the surface. When the novice or Minerval advanced to the second rank of Illuminatus Minor, and only those who were obviously ready for this knowledge were allowed to advance, he was told that the only obstacle which lay in the path of the order's goal of universal happiness was the power being held by the religious and governmental institutions of the world, which were just not going to allow such happiness to be made manifest at their expense. The leaders of these institutions, monarchs or future monarchs, and clergymen had to be either brought under the control of the order or destroyed. If such a prospect frightened the new Illuminatus Minor, if he still possessed any sense of traditional morality, he was kept inactive at this level until his ethical concepts were altered. Weishaupt put it very succinctly. He said, "These ruling powers are despots when they do not conduct themselves by its, that is, the order's, principles. And it is therefore our duty to surround them with its members so that the profane, the uninitiated, may have no access to them. Thus we are able most powerfully to promote the order's interests. If any person is more disposed to listen to princes than to the order, he is not fit for it and must rise no higher. We must do our utmost to procure the advancement of Illuminati into all important civil offices." Finally, after the candidate proved his absolute devotion to the secrets of the order as an Illuminatus Minor, he was allowed to enter the top circle of initiates as an Illuminatus Major, just under the position of Rex or King held by Weishaupt. You see, it was a triangular or pyramid-shaped organization. By now, all conventional idealism had been removed from the candidate, and he was told about the real objectives of the order. He was now required to take an oath which bound his every thought, action, and his fate to the administration of his superiors in the order. He knew now that the real aim of the order was rule of the world, to be accomplished after the destruction of all existing governments and religions. He was even required to learn how to write with both hands so that his handwriting would not remain the same and traceable if any correspondence he wrote were to be intercepted by civil authorities. His copy of the writings of the order was to be kept in a special container in his home which would ignite and destroy those writings if a non-member attempted to open it. In their correspondence, members of the Illuminati used the ancient names of people in history and ancient cities in historical places to refer to themselves and their locations in their correspondence. The secret and elaborate spy network was set up so that all members would constantly be checking on the loyalty of each other. The secret police of the order killed anyone who tried to inform the authorities about the conspiracy. This band was known as the Insinuating Brethren and had as its insignia an all-seeing eye. As I said, the structure of the order was pyramidal, with Weishaupt at the top, with 2 or 3 immediate subordinates. Each of these had 2 or 3 under their orders. Each of those 3 had several men who carried out their dictates, and so on. In their correspondence, as I said, they used ancient names and city places to disguise their real identity. Weishaupt also felt very strongly that the amorality of members of the order should be tested. And in their correspondence, we happen to know that he insisted upon the murder of someone whose present state would be embarrassing to the order publicly, and it was an order that had to be carried out by a close relative. So any scruples or traditional moral principles were to be abolished. How successful was this intricate conspiratorial structure of economic, social, political, and cultural elite in the province of Bavaria? Within 2 years after the founding of the order, all but 2 of the professorial chairs at the University of Ingolstadt were held by members of the order. Before 1789, it is estimated that there were at least 2,000 members of the order in the German-speaking lands. Many of these were ministers, mostly Protestant, lawyers, doctors, and even a few princes. None were members of the lower classes, the agricultural working masses, or the serfs. And this was also true with regard to France by 1789. The original writings of the order contained detailed instructions on how hatred and bloodshed might be created between different racial, religious, ethnic, and even sexual groups. The idea of promoting hatred between children and their parents was introduced. Even the kinds of buildings to be burned in urban insurrections were outlined. In short, practically everything subversive one sees totalitarians carrying out in the world today was planned and written down by Adam Weishaupt almost 200 years ago. An examination of his writings will fully substantiate this claim. Now, I think some people are curious to know how we know so much about this secret society. The way we know about it is because in 1785, the papers of the order were captured and seized by the elector, the prefect, the sheriff of Bavaria, translated and published throughout most of Western Europe, and of course these spread beyond that area to other parts of the world. One of the first places in which this information became available to the English-speaking literate population was in a book published in 1797 by John Robison, Proofs of a Conspiracy. Professor Robison was perhaps the leading author of science textbooks in the English-speaking world at that time, and his book, Proofs of a Conspiracy, had an extensive audience in both the United States, England, and several other countries. His book is very important because it contains extensive reprints and excerpts from these original papers of the Illuminati. An even more detailed exposition was prepared and published almost simultaneously by the Abbé Augustin Barruel, a 4-volume work called Memoirs Illustrating the History of Jacobinism, which is even more comprehensive in exposing this conspiracy, its ramifications, and its influence on the French Revolution. More recently, in the 20th century, the papers of the Illuminati have been, in several formats, translated in total and reprinted. A recent excerpting of some of these papers published in Germany is a compilation by Richard van Dulman, and it contains a lot of the original correspondence, the letters between Weishaupt and his various associates and agents in the conspiracy. So we're dealing here with primary source archival documentation, the original papers and correspondence of the conspirators that we're discussing. It was not until 6 years after the founding of the order, June and July of 1782, and this is still 3 years before the Illuminati was discovered and outlawed, at least publicly, by the state of Bavaria. It was not until 6 years after the founding of the order, in 1782, that it began to grow in power and influence outside the German-speaking lands. Having already contemplated the possibility of infiltrating the Freemasonic bodies of Western Europe and then taking control of them, Weishaupt and his brilliant disciple, Baron von Neig, who called himself Philo, at last had their chance. That summer, 1782, leaders and delegates of the continental European Freemasonic bodies were to meet at the town of Wilhelmsbad. Weishaupt and Neig joined them and presented quite an enticing promise of the secrets which the Illuminati had to offer. In response, many of the German, Italian, and French delegates joined and were to take the doctrines of the order and its degrees back to their individual lodges. The two leaders of German Freemasonry, Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick and Prince Karl of Hesse, joined the order, thus bringing the bulk of German Freemasonry under the control of the Illuminati. The Illuminatist Mirabeau was brought into the order while in Germany and was chosen to bring Weishaupt's system to France, to the lodges of the Reunited Friends, together with Bonneville and others. Among Mirabeau's recruits into the Illuminati in France were the Duc d'Orléans, Philippe Égalité, otherwise known, Brissot, Condorcet, Savoyet, Grégoire, Garat, Patillon, Babeuf, Barnave, Sieyès, Saint-Just, Camille Desmoulins, Hébert, Santerre, Danton, Marat, Chenier, and just about every other leader of the impending or upcoming French Revolution. Other members of the Illuminati included Herder, Goethe, the Marquis de Lafayette, who had played such an important role in assisting the American War for Independence, and Talleyrand. The charge of actually spreading the doctrines throughout France was given to Bode and Bush. So well did the Illuminati missionaries work that by 1788 every lodge of the French Grand Orient Freemasonic system, and they numbered in that year 266, is said to have been indoctrinated with the system of Weishaupt. The Illuminatist Duc d'Orléans was the leader of the Grand Orient Lodge in Paris. After the suppression of the Illuminati by the Bavarian government, part of the order system of operations did go underground and resurfaced by 1788 in the form of another organization called the German Union. This organization was directed by Dr. Karl Barth. And the purpose of the German Union was, for the sake of the Illuminati's conspiratorial goals, to gain control of book publishing and distribution in the German-speaking lands, to make sure that only books would be published and distributed which were sympathetic or accepting of the order's propaganda. This is a statement from the papers of the German Union, expressing their desire to establish reading societies and libraries under their control. It says, "When these have been established in different places, we must endeavor to accomplish the following intermediate plans. To introduce a general literary gazette or review, which by uniting all the learned brethren and combining with judgment and address all their talents, and steadily proceeding according to a distinct and precise plan, may in time supplant every other gazette, a thing which its intrinsic merit and comprehensive plan will easily accomplish. To select a secretary for our society, who shall have it in charge to commission the books which they shall select in conformity to the great aim of the order, and who shall undertake to commission all other books for the curious in his neighborhood. If there be a bookseller in the place who can be gained over and sworn into the society, it will be proper to choose him for this office, since, as will be made more plain afterwards, the trade will gradually come into the plan and fall into the hands of the Union." The purpose of this was to monopolize control over existing print media at the turn of the 19th century. In 1789, in France, more social and economic reform under the regime of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette had occurred than had been the case in that country by any standard of comparison during the past 50 years. It's very interesting to note that the principal events which triggered the French Revolution were almost totally stage-managed and contrived by Illuminist agents or agents of the Illuminized Jacobin clubs that had come out of the Grand Orient Freemasonic structure taken over by agents of Weishaupt. All of this was managed by Louis-Philippe Joseph, the Duke of Orleans, or Philippe Égalité, as he liked to call himself, who was the director of the Grand Orient Lodge and a close relative of King Louis XVI. It's interesting that the famine during early 1789 was largely the result of the Duke's agents buying up grain commodities and storing them inaccessible to the public, then sending his agents out with the story and the line that the king and the queen have selfishly kept this food from the people, blaming the king and trying to create animosity against the king for what he had secretly done himself. This was unsuccessful because the great majority of Parisians and Frenchmen were very loyal to their monarch, to their state, to their church. It was necessary to perpetrate an incredible deception to get one of the most historically misrepresented incidents of 1789 and the French Revolution underway, and that was the siege of the Bastille. The Bastille is fictitiously portrayed in the works of Thomas Carlyle and Charles Dickens as a relic, a monument to the old regime of torture and brutality, a place feared and hated by the common man in France. It was a French prison, but by 1789 it had fallen into disuse, and by the time it was stormed in the middle of that year on July 14th by a crowd not really knowing what it was doing, as I'll explain in a moment, they found a very small number of people inside, 7 inhabitants, all living quite comfortably in what they had been told was a horrible monstrosity of despotism. There were 7 people there, 4 forgers, 2 lunatics who were mad before they were imprisoned, and 1 nobleman who had been incarcerated at the request of his family. So it's interesting that the way the crowd was convinced by the Illuminist agents among them to attack the Bastille, and a minor insurrection was started in another part of the city, and the loyal Parisians were told by the rumor mongers that weapons and ammunition were stored in the Bastille, and they could protect their king and their city from this insurrection by going to the Bastille in a large crowd, getting those weapons, and defending their property. When they came to the Bastille, the guards there did not know why the mob was advancing, and lacking any information or understanding of what was happening, fired upon the crowd, and this precipitated the bloodshed and the siege of the building, which is so tragically commemorated today as a strike against the old regime and an uprising of the people in Paris. Hardly. It's estimated that only 1 out of every 800 people in Paris at that time even participated in the siege of the Bastille, and I'm amazed to note that even Orthodox historians are beginning to accept the reality of this historical event. One of the goals of the conspirators during the French Revolution was to perfect a strategy called the manufactured smear, a deliberate campaign of disinformation to ridicule, undermine, and slander their enemies. In this case, King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. One of the Illuminists, Joseph Balsamo, who called himself Cagliostro, staged a personal scandal in which Queen Marie Antoinette was not even involved, not even aware, called the Diamond Necklace Affair, and created a scandal which gave the appearance of impropriety on her part, and this was used by the Illuminist agents to spread scurrilous propaganda and disinformation to embarrass both the monarchy and the church. It was perhaps the first textbook utilization of the strategy of the manufactured smear, something the conspiracy has continued to utilize against its most obvious and effective enemies ever since. Finally, the French Revolution devolved into not only the regicide, the killing of the guillotining of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, but also the Reign of Terror, which over a period of several years probably produced 300,000 casualties in France. Approximately 270,000 of these lives that were lost in this bloodshed were the lower classes, the poorer people the people who were supposed to be the beneficiaries of the revolution. But since the violence and turmoil got out of control, many of the original conspirators who had precipitated it, planned it, and brought about its major events were also caught up and destroyed in the conflagration they had started. Some of the conspirators at this time looked for a solution, someone who would come in militarily and impose the New World Order, the Universal Republic, the world dominion that the conspiracy sought as a supposed solution to the chaos and destruction which they had triggered in France. The man they obviously groomed for this role was a young Corsican lieutenant, Napoleon Bonaparte. And Bonaparte was, it is known, initiated perhaps as many as 3 times into the lodges of the Illuminati at various locations. You're now looking at a document from the Transactions of the Ars Quatuor Coronatorum, a British Freemasonic history journal, which records and documents at least 2 or 3 of these initiations of young Bonaparte into the Illuminati. The problem is that after he assumed his imperial position and began to move the crowned heads of state and leaders of various monarchies around like men on a chessboard and place his relatives in command of part of his growing empire, he began to enjoy his imperial power. He began to make peace with the church that he had originally been directed to destroy, and he became a liability or uncontrollably independent as a rival source of power. So the evidence is very strong that not only was Napoleon a personal victim of the Illuminati after he had served his purpose and was no longer controllable. Several years ago, research scientists established from the existing remains of Napoleon that he had been slowly poisoned to death. But also, it's very clear that a number of the latter battles toward the time of his defeat were actually the result of false information deliberately given to him and his corps of leadership by agents of the Illuminati, some of whom had been his principal supporters in the beginning. Now, as we turn to examine some of the evidence about the Illuminati's responsibility for the French Revolution, some of the sources of this information, there's probably no more remarkable source than a book or lengthy tract that was published and circulated in France in 1789, several months before the revolution broke out. It was written by the Marquis de Leuchert, who was an aristocrat who had briefly been a member of the Illuminati's Grand Orient Lodges. And before the revolution breaks out, he is warning the French people, and this is a direct quote. Deluded people, learn that there exists a conspiracy in favor of despotism, against liberty, of incapacity against talent, of vice against virtue, of ignorance against enlightenment. This society aims at governing the world. Its object is universal domination. This plan may seem extraordinary, incredible, yes, but not chimerical. No such calamity has ever yet afflicted the world. And this is a remarkable document because it's not an interpretation after the fact by a secondary historian. It's someone warning the people of France before the events actually took place. Another interesting primary source from behind the scenes, from personal involvement, was J.J. Mounier's On the Influence Attributed to Freemasons, Philosophers, Freemasons, and the Illuminati for the Revolution in France, which was largely written as a defense of Mounier's participation in the drafting of the Oath of the Tennis Court, in the Girondin faction movement, and in some of the early events of the Revolution. This book, in spite of being critical of the works of Robison and Barruel and other critics of the Revolution, defending somewhat the idealism that motivated this man, in this book he admits largely the role of the Illuminati in the Grand Orient in precipitating these events and largely confirms the thesis. So that's an additional source of admission from the other side. Perhaps the most remarkable recent document was one discovered in the 1940s. It was drafted by the Count de Mirabeau, one of the leaders of the French Revolution, one of the leaders of the Illuminati's Grand Orient Lodge. It was a plan for the political infiltration and utilization of Freemasonry in France. And it was discovered in the 1940s and published in an issue of the British Freemasonic journal, the Ars Quatuor Coronatorum, or Transactions of the AQC. It is the equivalent of finding a written plan for the revolution and the use of of infiltrated French Freemasonry prior to the execution of the events. So we're talking about very primary source documentation to substantiate the statement that the Illuminati, working through the Grand Orient Lodges, was responsible for bringing about the French Revolution. Many Orthodox historians wonder if, or doubt, that the Illuminati survived its outlawing by the Bavarian government in 1785, and they claim that it either went underground or ceased to exist. It's very clear that the Illuminati and Weishaupt himself and his principal agents continued to function actively after that point. In 1913 in France, there was published a book of correspondence and commentary, the writings of the Marquis de Chateaubriand de Monde, who used the very interesting pseudonym you see in the title of this book, the compilation of those documents. This covers the period 1800 to 1815 and establishes very carefully in the correspondence we see the connection of Weishaupt with agents acting at that time to spread the Illuminati system beyond France into other countries. One of the places where the armies of Napoleon first spread the Illuminist lodges was the nation of Ireland. The French troops invaded Bantry Bay in Ireland in 1798, and already by that time, organizations the Illuminati had established there existed in both the Protestant and Catholic communities. One of these, the United Irishmen, which later gave rise to the Sinn Féin, the Clanna Gael, and the Irish Republican Army of the early 20th century, the United Irishmen had a structure virtually identical to that of the Illuminati, the pyramidal structure, and the purpose of this organization was to create hatred between Catholic and Protestant citizens in Ireland and eventually break Ireland away from affiliation with Great Britain, not only for the purpose of destroying the British Empire, but for bringing Ireland separately under the conspiracy's control. Now, we happen to know the continuity of the conspiracy's work in Ireland as a result of a remarkable book published about 1920, The Secret Societies of Ireland, by the former Chief of Police of Ireland, Hugh Bertie Campbell Pollard. This is a very important book, which I hope we will be able to reprint with updating commentary in the near future, because it provides a complete continuity from the United Irishmen in the period of the late 18th century up through the 1920s and the violence of the Easter Rebellion. Similar Illuminist activity was, of course, spread into the nation of Russia. And this occurred both as a result of the Napoleonic Army invasion of Russia, bringing Illuminized troops and agents into the country, but also the fact that in the early decades of the 19th century, under the reign of Tsar Alexander I, the Illuminati had already infiltrated the court. An Illuminist agent, Frederick La Harpe, was a tutor to Alexander I, and the infiltration of the court was remarkably advanced by that time. In 1825, the first revolutionary violence was deliberately stage-managed and triggered in Russia, and that was the Decembrist Revolt. Here you see a picture of Alexander I and his brother Nicholas I. And it was when Alexander I chose to abdicate the throne, to retire from rule in 1825, that the Illuminati seized upon this decision to create an insurrection in St. Petersburg based on a false lie, a prevarication, a rumor they had spread to military troops there that Nicholas was usurping the throne from his brother Constantine, which of course was not the case. But they were able to provoke a revolt which was falsely portrayed in a lot of subsequent historical treatment as an early revolt against the Tsarist system. One of the principal opponents of the Illuminati throughout Europe during the 20th century, and certainly in the German-speaking lands, was the Austrian Chancellor and leading Austrian statesman of the 19th century, Prince von Metternich. And Metternich was very crucially aware of the spread of the Illuminati because the same Illuminist tutor to Alexander I had attempted to influence him with revolutionary ideas as a child. And he had turned against them so much because of his disgust at this attempt at recruitment. He wrote in 1832 regarding the activity of the Illuminati and its agents in the German-speaking lands. And he said as follows: Germany has long suffered from the evil which is now spread over the whole of Europe. In some sense, the evil may be said to have been in existence there previous to the outbreak in France in 1789. The sect of the Illuminati, the first radical association, owed its existence long before that time to the weakness of the Bavarian government and the complicity of several men who were among its members from the first. This sect, in spite of all endeavors on the part of the same government to put it down by the severest measures of repression, has never ceased to exist from that time forward, and has assumed in turn, according to circumstances and the requirements of the moment, the names of Tugendbund, or Band of Virtue, and Burschenschaften. What Metternich was referring to by the 1830s were a number of student associations which came directly out of the structure of the original German Illuminati. The Tugendbund was organized in the German-speaking lands after 1815, after the Congress of Vienna, after the attempt by the powers of Europe to put Europe back together in a way that it had been prior to the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. After 1815, what is today Germany was a loose confederation of several dozen separate monarchies, states, principalities, the leading, obvious, most powerful one being Prussia. In the context of Prussia, the Illuminati planned to launch a movement to unify all of Germany under one dictatorial central government which would be both able to destroy the influence of the church in the German-speaking lands, but also consolidate a totalitarian socialist central government, and which would actually take place within about 5 decades. This had been the plan from the beginning. One of the early Illuminists in Germany, the Marquis de Constanza, had said, "In Germany there must be 1 or 2 princes at the most, and these princes must be Illuminized and so led by our adepts and surrounded by them that no profane man may approach their persons." Even the Prussian agent Anacharsis Cloots, another Illuminist, had referred to the immutable empire of the great Germany, the Universal Republic, before his death in 1794. The entire movement for German unification in the 19th century came directly out of the Illuminati because it was impossible to control all these separate small monarchies in a confederation. They had to be consolidated into one central government. This movement in Germany had, of course, the infiltration at least, had begun earlier. Under Frederick the Great, Frederick Wilhelm II, the Hohenzollern family had been infiltrated and brought into German Freemasonic structure and influenced by the doctrines of the Illuminati. One of the leaders of the German unification campaign was the German diplomat, the Prussian diplomat, Baron von Stein. He also played a crucial role earlier in the destruction of Napoleon, the final defeat of Napoleon, and he also had an influential role as an ambassador to Russia from the state of Prussia in bringing about the Decembrist revolt in 1825. Some of our sources on these German secret societies and their responsibility for the German unification campaign include a book published in Paris in 1819 on the history of the German secret societies. A very similar parallel movement was begun about 1815 to 1820 in the Italian-speaking lands. After 1815, what is today the nation of Italy was also a loose confederation of small, separate monarchical states, duchies, principalities. The most influential, of course, at that time being the Papal States, and the influence of the Church being very crucial in all of them. The largest, most influential political state was Piedmont under the monarchical family of the House of Savoy. And it was in the Kingdom of Piedmont that the Illuminati principally launched a 5-decade-long advance toward a similar goal, and that was the consolidation of all power in the Italian-speaking lands in the hands of one dictatorial central government which would usurp and supplant the influence and role of the Catholic Church in the Italian lands. You're looking at this map about 1815 at the state of the Italian Confederation at that time. The leader of the Italian unification movement and the Illuminist agent most responsible for organizing its structure and operations was Giuseppe Mazzini, the founder of Young Italy, the leader of the Italian Carbonari, and what was called the Alta Vendita, the Haute Vent Romaine, the highest lodge of Grand Orient Italian Freemasonry. Mazzini, of course, was the leader of this campaign. His principal military officer was Giuseppe Garibaldi, here pictured toward the end of his life after the campaign was successful. And we did learn a number of interesting lessons about the conspiracy strategy during these decades leading up to 1870, when both the German unification and the Italian unification so tragically were completed. One of these is the way in which the Illuminati controls and disciplines its political beneficiaries, those politicians and other prominent people who rise to power, status, and position as a result of affiliation and cooperation or membership or agency in the conspiracy. A good example of this and how these people are controlled and disciplined if they ever get out of line is the case of Francesco Crispi, an Italian politician who up until 1861 had cooperated wholeheartedly with the revolutionary drive for Italian unification, the Risorgimento movement. But out of expediency, as a rather routine politician, by 1861, he didn't know whether Mazzini's faction would be successful in achieving the consolidation or whether it might be done by the House of Savoy, King Victor Emmanuel in the Kingdom of Piedmont. So he went to King Victor Emmanuel and he began to offer his services. This plan was discovered by Mazzini's spies in 1862, and they decided to teach Crispi a lesson. In April 1862, he attended a dinner of the revolutionaries, the so-called Emancipation Association at Turin. He fell ill during the dinner, and in a state of appalling agony, or so those who were witnessing the scene recount, he went unconscious. He woke up, and Mazzini was standing in the room, and he did not even know whether he was still alive or whether this was all a dream. And Mazzini began to speak to him, and he said, "You live, yes, Francesco, but henceforth you are more completely enslaved than the last of the Negroes for whose freedom they are fighting over there in America. You live again, and your ambition will be gratified. You will be minister of the monarchy, but you will hold in your hands the reins of government, but without betraying us, without selling yourself. You will part from us, not privately, but publicly. We will denounce you, and while denouncing you, we will push you to power. It is the monarchy that you will betray by executing our orders, when we shall have made you minister of the crown. And you will obey us in all things, even should the orders we give you seem contradictory, even should their execution cause you to pass for a madman in the eyes of Europe. Yes, Francesco Crispi, from this day forward you belong to us, for you must never forget that, should you place us in a position where it might be expedient to cut short your own existence a second time, no power in the world could save you from the death, the sufferings of which you have known today." And of course, they administered an antidote to the poison they had given him. In 1864, Crispi, on orders from his master Mazzini, became a royalist and denounced Mazzini and his movement. Crispi became Minister of the Interior in 1878, after the unification of Italy was complete, and he served additional roles from 1887 to 1891, and then 93 to 96, he was the Prime Minister of Italy. So he went all the way to the top of the political structure, still under the control and obvious discipline of the conspiracy. We might think of this as perhaps one of the first Watergates of the past. The other beneficiary and major supporter in a high-level position of the Risorgimento campaign, King Victor Emmanuel, died on January 9th, 1878, and was succeeded by Humbert I. In 1884, Humbert was initiated into Masonry as a Knight Kadash under conditions of the greatest secrecy and in the lodge of the Savoy Illuminati. He was not to last long either, and he was assassinated at the turn of the century. How do we know about the conspiracy's work in the Italian-speaking lands? A great deal of primary source documentation is available. In 1821, in England, a translation of the papers of the Carbonari, the main structure of the Illuminized Grand Orient Freemasonry in Italy, and the conspiracy's acting arm were published. These papers and original correspondence have been captured by police agents, and they're published in English, and we hope that they'll be reprinted in the near future. Probably the most important source on this subject is the work of Crétinot-Jolet, The Roman Church Against the Revolution. And in this book we have excerpts from very important permanent instructions prepared by Filippo Buonarroti, one of the leading agents of Adam Weishaupt after 1800. These instructions, prepared about 1815, were not only to be carried out by agents in the Italian unification campaign, but by Illuminists all over the world and subsequent to that time. These instructions were very lengthy, and I want to just quote on two specific principles or strategies. First of all, these instructions written by Buonarroti express the motivation of the conspiracy. Many people and Orthodox historians have asked, how could people set up a conspiracy like this 200 years ago, a conspiracy to rule the world, when they knew at the time they'd never live to see the end of it? How could they be motivated for something like that in the future? Well, Buonarroti in the instructions spoke to that motivation. He said, "The work for which we gird ourselves up is not the work of a day, nor of a month, nor of a year. It may last for many years, perhaps for a century. In our ranks the soldier dies, but the war is continued. We trust that we may yet attain this supreme object of our efforts, but when and how, the unknown, cannot yet be seen. Nevertheless, as nothing should move us from our mapped-out plan, we must labor at our newly commenced work as if tomorrow was to crown it with success." Obviously, they had what we might call a religious zeal or religious idealism motivating them, and it was definitely of a satanic nature. Another important excerpt from these original papers explains how the technique of the manufactured smear could be used to destroy the reputation of church and state opponents to the Italian unification campaign. And this is what the instructions said to do. "Little can be done with old cardinals and with prelates of a decided character. Such incorrigibles must be left to the school of Consalvi, and in our magazines of popularity and unpopularity, we must find the means to utilize or ridicule power in their hands. A well-invented report must be spread with tact among good Christian families. Such a cardinal, for instance, is a miser, such a prelate is licentious, such an official is a free thinker, an infidel, a Freemason, and so on in the same strain. These things will spread quickly to the cafes, thence to the squares, and one report is sometimes enough to ruin a man. If a prelate or bishop arrive in a province from Rome to celebrate or officiate at some public function, it is necessary at once to become acquainted with his character, his antecedents, his temperament, his defects, especially his defects. If he should be an enemy, and they give several examples, at once trap him, entangle him in all the nets and snares you can. Give him a character which must horrify the young people and the women. Describe him as cruel, heartless, and bloodthirsty. Relate some atrocious transaction which will easily cause a sensation amongst the people. The foreign newspapers shall learn and copy these facts, which they will know how to embellish and color according to their usual style. For respect due to truth, show, or better still, quote from some respectable fool as having quoted the number of the journal which has given the names, acts, and doings of these personages. As in England and in France, so also in Italy, there will be no lack of writers who well know how to tell lies for the good cause and have no difficulty in doing so. One newspaper publishing the name of a Monsignor Delegate, His Excellency or Eminence or Lord Justice, will be quite sufficient proof for the people. They will require no other. The people here around us in Italy are in the infancy of liberalism. At present, they believe in the liberals. After a little, they will believe in anything, unquote. So I think you can see the continuity and importance of the technique of disinformation or the manufactured smear, which the conspiracy has used as one of its most valuable weapons, even up to the present time. Another important source published in France in the 1930s was this book on the Italian secret societies. Interestingly enough, it focused on the fact that a branch of the original Carbonari movement under Mazzini, originally called the Turba or the Mob, gave birth to the organization of the Mafia, which was originally a criminal aggrandizement branch of the Illuminati for fundraising purposes to support the revolutionary campaign, but which grew and emerged and evolved into its own criminal operations and its own freelancing projects. The source on Francesco Crispi is a remarkable and sadly virtually unobtainable French work, a biography of Francesco Crispi by Diana Vaughan. And this introduces a very complex amount of evidence which amounted to or was the focus of a scandal in France from 1885, principally in Paris, from 1885 to 1897, called the Palladian Rite controversy. From 1885 to 1893, a massive number of books and periodicals were published, written by people who claimed to have been members of the top level of Illuminized Grand Orient Freemasonry, both in Italy and France and other countries. One of these people, an American lady named Diana Vaughan, went into hiding and wrote from seclusion that she was a principal leader of this secret society at the top level. And from this information, we had underlined or underscored the fact that the top level of the conspiracy has always been, from the beginning, not atheistic, not materialistic, but formally Satanist or Luciferian in its religious idealism. Worshipping, in effect, a doctrine or believing in a doctrine which is technically called Manichaeism, which is a mirror image or reversal of Judeo-Christian theology. The God of the Christians and the Jews in this system is the evil deity or the devil, and the devil or Lucifer or Satan figure in Judeo-Christian theology is the angel of light and the object of worship of these Satanists or Luciferians. What you're seeing is the only known picture of Diana Vaughan prior to her disappearance and probable assassination. Agents of the conspiracy managed to obscure this information by discrediting one or two of the people involved in the publication of this massive amount of work in the Palladian Rite controversy in Paris. But there was so much corroboration from other authors like Domenico Margiotta that the aggregate amount of evidence establishes very clearly that this was a rare look inside the top satanic level of the Illuminati, and also a very good source of documentation on the control of the Italian unification campaign. The problem is that the evidence has to be examined very carefully, and the reliable and independently able to be corroborated material has to be separated from material which is much more poorly supported. The Illuminati also spread in France, consolidated its power, France being already a unified nation-state after the restoration of Europe at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. A Bourbon member of the Bourbon monarchical family, Louis XVIII, was put on the throne. He only lasted a few years, being replaced by Charles X, and then a revolutionary government called the July Monarchy under Louis Blanc supplanted control in France and began to reestablish revolutionary fervor, leading up to a series of simultaneously triggered riots and insurrections in the year 1848, both in France and other European countries. A good deal of information about this was reported in a book by a French police investigator, Lucien de Lahad, called The Cradle of Rebellions, or A History of Secret Societies in France. We know that there is a direct continuity between the original Bavarian Illuminati and the Marxian socialist movement. Here is the continuity. Two principal agents of Adam Weishaupt, Filippo Buonarroti, who formed an organization called the Sublime Perfect Masters, and Louis-Auguste Blanqui, who formed a French organization called the Society of the Seasons, were the principal organizers of a third organization in both Paris and London called the League of the Just. And the League of the Just was directed by Wilhelm Weitling, whose picture you see here. And Weitling was a close associate of a young 28-year-old hack newspaper writer named Karl Marx, who was beginning to try to enter himself into the growing revolutionary socialist movements and circles at that time. Weitling, as a leader of the League of the Just, along with Friedrich Engels, hired Karl Marx in 1847 to rewrite the existing Illuminist plan and bring it up to date in the context of a rapidly industrializing British Industrial Revolution economy, and the result was the Communist Manifesto. If you read the Communist Manifesto and compare it with the original writings of the Illuminati, you will see that there is nothing original, that it is simply a rewriting and update of that original strategy. So unimportant was Marx that his name did not appear on a printed copy of the Manifesto for over 20 years. And of course, when the League of the Just published the Communist Manifesto in 1848, they changed their name to the Communist League. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of part one of our review of this evidence. In part two, we will examine the infiltration of the Illuminati's activity into the United States, the early American Republic, the turbulent period of the so-called Civil War in the 19th century, and bring this up to date into the 20th century.